Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. Okay, so welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm here with my wonderful guest, Dr. Carolina Kuepper-Tetzel. So thank you so much, Carolina, for accepting my invitation. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very well today.
Good.
It's a beautiful May here in Glasgow. The sun is shining and it's gorgeous. It's one of those weeks here in
Really,
Glasgow.
yeah. You know, I had a teacher, a professor from Scotland when I was studying at the University of Bristol, Bill Brown, and quite the character. And I think he told me that, when summer is coming because the rain gets warmer. Does that sound true at all? Or usually the weather is not that great in Scotland, right?
Yeah. So we have quite a lot of rain, and I still have to experience warm rain. So I haven't experienced warm rain yet. So when it rains, it usually the temperature drops. But we have a couple of weeks in Glasgow. Usually they are in May, where it's absolutely gorgeous, and we're in the middle of that right now, which is amazing.
Well, so enjoy, I'm glad for you. And I want to ask you one of those, big thought-provoking questions about science and the science of learning. But I'm curious about something you told me when I invited you. You said something about Brazil and your connection, because I'm Brazilian, right? So what is your connection with Brazil exactly?
So I was born in Brazil.
Wow.
In São Paulo, and I lived there for 4 years, and we moved when I was turning 4 to Germany. So I started some kindergarten in Brazil. And then we moved, and the rest of my education was then in Germany.
Wow. So you were Brazilian.
I still have family. Yeah, I'm Brazilian. So
You're
I still
Brazilian.
have family
Wow.
there. Yes, I am.
That's amazing.
So I still have family there. They all live, in São Paulo. But so I have a strong connection. I try to go back there every other year to see family and to spend time there. So
Yeah. And can you speak any Portuguese or?
Eu falo português, sim. Eu falo português.
Que maravilha! Você fala português.
Sim.
That's amazing, yeah. And I can speak, ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch sprechen. Nicht so gut, yeah. Aber ich kann gut verstehen, yeah. I understand it well. But yeah, that's amazing. Wonderful. Well, now let me ask you that question. I always start with why science, Carolina? Because I think you could have picked anything, right? But growing up, was there, I don't know, maybe someone who inspired you, a famous scientist, or was it your family? Why did you pick that particular field?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because when I picked psychology, I picked psychology for a very different reason early on. So when I picked psychology, I wasn't even aware that it was a science. So I picked it because I was intrigued by the idea to become a therapist. And that was early on. I think I was in 9th grade when I thought that's an interesting profession. And the more I started thinking about that psychology as a degree and as a subject, the more I understood what it meant. So when I finished my schooling, I still wanted to do psychology, but with a very different direction. So I therapy wasn't was what was interesting to me anymore, and I wanted to do psychology to do marketing research.
Oh,
So I
interesting.
already had the idea, that insights from psychology can help me to, to increase marketing strategies and so on.
Yeah.
And when I started my studies in my first semester back then, it fully hit me how much science psychology is,
Yeah.
because the entire beginning of the studies, and that's throughout, it doesn't matter where you study it, if you study it in Germany, where I did, or in the US or UK and so on, the entire first couple of years is all about the scientific method. It's all
Yes.
about systematically finding answers to questions, right? Using experiments, manipulating some variables, doing surveys, and finding that a way to get clearer ideas and progress knowledge in that way. So the more I studied it, the more I understood, oh yeah, so that's it, right? I'm part of that,
Yeah.
like that scientific community that is contributing to generating knowledge, understanding how we think, how we remember information, how we behave, how we feel emotions, and
Exactly.
so on. And so that was quite interesting, because it was pretty much during my studies when I had this realization what comes with it.
Oh,
And
okay. Yeah.
what's funny about this is that it still is like that with students nowadays when they start their studies in psychology. They preconception what psychology is. And then in the first couple of years, they're like, oh, okay, there's so much more to it. There's so much more systematic research around it. We need statistics. We need these kind of methods to help us to find really answers to research questions.
Yes, and you hadn't become a teacher at that stage, I think, because you are now a teacher, professor. And did that lead you into teaching, or it was just a
Yes.
happy coincidence? Yeah.
So I think as part of my PhD, when when I was working on my PhD, the way the system works in Germany is usually you work 50% of your time on your PhD, and 50% you have a teaching position,
Yeah.
and you teach seminars and so on. And so that's when I started dipping my toes into teaching. That was back in, I don't know, 2007 or so. And I immediately developed this interest and passion for teaching. It was from the beginning one of the most rewarding things I did. I did my PhD alongside, and I had finished that. And after my PhD, I went to do two postdocs, and the postdocs were really about research. Were
Yeah.
really about, you know, still investigating those different learning effects. So I still kept my part of my mind was always about application of those strategies or findings and so on. But during my postdoc, it was really all about research projects and so on. And during that time, I felt that I really missed teaching. So when it was time to apply for positions after my postdoc, I applied for everything, right?
Sure.
At this,
Yeah.
whatever you can get,
Whatever,
right?
whatever comes up, right? Let's
I
try.
know, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
there's sometimes
Yeah.
very little choice. But during my postdoc, in the end, I was kind of applying to research positions, and I
Okay.
was applying to teaching positions in higher education. And it was very funny because I was sitting back then at the kitchen table, and my husband would stop by and say, "Oh, I know what you're applying for right now."
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm like, well, what do you mean? You're applying for a research position. I'm like, how do you know this? I'm like, you're grumpy.
Okay.
You're grumpy.
Sure. Yeah.
And whenever I was applying for a teaching position, I was like all in, like getting the resources together,
Wow, look at
super
that.
happy and excited and talking about it. So immediately he said, it doesn't matter if you ever offered a position for research. That's not your identity. That's not what you're
Yeah.
where your strength is the teaching track, like standing in front of people, exploring topics with them, teaching them, and still using research to improve teaching, to always have that link. But the big thing that keeps me going is the interactions in the classroom.
That's amazing. And, as a teacher myself and, someone who's an advocate, let's say, for the science of learning, I think you started using your students as guinea pigs, right? For the things you discovered in the lab. But this is the question I want to ask. I think the science of learning is something that I believe has tremendous potential and really can help empower teachers all over the world. It's something I'm passionate about. I know you are as well. I've been interviewing a lot of learning scientists, if I can call them that. And I think there are some people who don't believe in this power that the science of learning has. But I want you to tell me a little bit about the science of learning. What is the science of learning? And why do you think it matters more than ever, especially nowadays for teachers, who are trying to improve their practice or at least rethink their practice and try other things that might have a major impact on students' outcomes, right? So why is the science of learning important, Carolina?
I think for me, the science of learning is a research field that investigates how we learn information, how we maintain knowledge, how we apply knowledge, how can learning be made more effective in a way that students can not only recall something for an immediate test, but learning for life and for long term. And I use the science of learning I see the science of learning as a tool that can help me, again, going back to the answers to questions, right? Yeah. In a more systematic way. So I might want to find out, there are different learning conditions, and I'm not sure which one is better. And I want to pitch them against each other and to find out, okay, if I do A and I do B, which one gives me the better result in regard to performance, in regard to student confidence, and so on. And I think that's what the science of learning is for me. For me, it's a tool that I use to help me make decisions, right? Yeah. It's part of the puzzle. So sometimes, there may be the misconception that the science of learning holds all the answers, which we're not there yet, right? We're still investigating, we're still building knowledge, learning new things. Also, the environment changes.
And there are too many variables, right? I think
there's so many variables.
It's chaotic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, in the classroom, there's so many different variables and so on. And very often, we can find some answer that can help us inform our practice and can give us a bit more, maybe a limited range of movement, which is sometimes helpful to have, I feel, because, if you want to try something new, it's like where to start. And people may have different approaches on where to start, but my approach personally is to think about, has there been any research done in this? What did they do? How did they conduct the research? What did they find? Who were the people they conducted it on? What were the materials used? And then trying to find more of those studies and see where are, the things that overlap, that I can use then as a general idea for my practice, right?
Yes. So basically, it's I like to think of the science of learning as a toolbox, that gives you a lot of ideas, a lot of tools, that you can use, but it doesn't really tell you what you need to use every day in every lesson. It just tells you, if you have this issue, you might want to use this tool, because according to research, that's what probably works best, probably considering, this variable and that variable. But maybe there's something else you cannot see, you cannot understand. Does that make sense at all?
Exactly. I think it makes complete sense, right? So there's one way that we can see what the research is telling us. within the parameters that they have investigated a specific, let's say, learning phenomenon. And then, there is the knowledge you bring in. What does your classroom look like? Who are your students, and so on. And one example that I like to give is, let's say, retrieval practice, right? So the idea that you perform better on later tests if you have engaged in retrieving information from memory as a form of revising, of practicing and studying. And retrieval practice can look very different. And the thing is, depending on who your students are, they may need more scaffolding. They may need a bit more cues or link or hints and so on to actually get to the process of retrieving information from memory, right?
Perfect.
So I think that's why the science of learning can give us some ideas, and then we need our own understanding and expertise of our students, our classroom, to make it work and implement that idea.
That's so true. And I want to ask you another tough question, because I asked the last guest I had on this show, so what is learning? I think learning can be defined in many different ways, but I want you to give us your definition of learning, because then I want to ask you, can we think of learning as something that has universal principles that we need to learn about so we can better design our practice, our instructions, or is it something that cannot be reduced to those universal principles? So what is learning, Carolina?
What's learning?
Yeah.
What is learning? I mean, learning is, when you add something new, when there's a change in behavior, when there's a change in your understanding compared to something, before and after. If you are building up towards something, this can be skills, this can be knowledge. So it's kind of a building of connections and building of understanding and skills, and so on. And it's quite interesting, because a couple of years ago there was a very interesting paper on the difference between learning and performance. Because actually, when we measure learning, what we do, we always sorry, someone came in? Went away.
Don't worry, I can edit out, or maybe I can keep it and we can have fun.
Keep it. It's fun.
Well, my cats are not here, but otherwise they would be all over this video right now. So don't worry about it.
That's fine. So I think, where was I? Yeah. So there was this paper.
Learning and performance, right?
Learning and performance, and obviously when we give a test, what we're measuring is performance, right? So because sometimes, it may take some time to show a specific that learning occurred on the test. There may be some forgetting, but not fully. So it may be reactivated, and all of a sudden we see evidence for it again. So there are different ways on how to capture this.
I just wanted to add that Robert Bjork talks a lot about this, difference between performance and learning, because, we can perform quite well after a few minutes or a few hours, that we received input, and then, you can do a test and you perform well. And I think all students know this, so sometimes you study overnight and you pass the exam, but if anyone asks you anything about the test 2 days later, you don't remember much, right? So you completely forgot. So it doesn't mean you have learned. It was just performed well. And sometimes the opposite is also true, right, Carolina? You have learned something, you know how to do it, but then you froze. And you couldn't perform, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So
and I think that's quite helpful to understand as well. And it's quite helpful to support students in understanding their own, understanding of a topic, and their own experiences in exams as well. So I think it's quite helpful to understand, as a teacher, to understand that difference, so you can support your students accordingly.
Perfect. So the question now is, are there universal learning principles based on biology, physiology, that we should understand better? Because, I think one of the main critiques or the criticism about the science of learning is that we cannot reduce learning, which is a human feature, let's say, to very simplistic techniques or strategies or things that should happen. But I tend to think of the science of learning as something that is trying to understand how learning works physiologically and cognitively and emotionally and all of those together. Kind of like what physics does, I think physics tries to understand the laws of the universe and how the universe works and how gravity works and air resistance. And then based on that, we can build planes and cars and things like that, things that move. So I think the science of learning is trying to do that. But of course, it's more complex, because we're not dealing with inanimate objects, and we're dealing with human beings with emotions. So would you say that there are universal principles that we should learn?
So I think with the science of learning, and I think you answered your own question. And I think with the,
Well,
I think with the science of learning, I think with the science of learning and the way I approach it from a cognitive psychology point of view is looking at, specific principles and understanding why they work. So why are they effective in order to study and to perform well in the long term, right? And I use those principles and then look at what are the processes, right? So if I think about retrieval practice,
yes.
It's about that effortful process to recall information. And we know that whenever we do recall information, that strengthens that information, that makes it stick a bit better in our memory. And the more often we do it, and the more often we do it after some time, which adds space practice. So, the idea that we introduce some forgetting, and then we recover that information, we reactivate that information. We know that this is something that's really useful to do in order to maintain that information for a longer period of time. The more you do it, the longer period you wait. Overall, we know that's something that's really helpful for learning and for studying.
That's so true.
So I'm trying to think about these kind of processes and think about, okay, can we apply those processes now in the classroom, right? Can we create conditions in the classroom where we encourage everyone to attempt to recall information, where we encourage them that even if it's sometimes difficult to do that process or to engage in that process, and if we see that maybe some students are struggling with that, because retrieval practice is only effective if you can actually retrieve information, right? Then it's probably time to give a hint, right? To give some kind of hint for them to get to the stage where they can engage in that retrieval. And I think using that is what makes, for me, the science of learning quite powerful tool, because you can use it flexibly.
Exactly.
In a book that I have co-authored with my learning scientist colleagues, came out 2 years ago. It's Ace That Test, The Student's Guide to Learning Better. In that book, I think the first or the second chapter is about what science is and what the science of learning is. And our whole thing is that with that book, we wanted it to be that students are able to apply it flexibly into their study routines, right? So for them to understand why a specific strategy is helpful, and then to find a way, and we give advice or kind of practical advice on how to then implement that. But to think about it, there's not one way to do and to apply that one strategy. There are actually quite different ways to do that. And so I think that's what makes it a powerful toolbox, to say.
Yeah, so exactly. It's not dictating exactly, every move, let's say, in the classroom, but it's really empowering teachers with the knowledge of how physiology works in that. So, you just talked about forgetting. And I was thinking about, again, Bjork, desirable difficulties and spacing and varying and testing. Those are things that apparently work quite well, no matter what you're learning. Because those are principles that I tend to think of them as universal principles of learning, right? Because it really makes you make that effort to learn. It's not something you read and then you're very passive about it, but you are actually engaging with the material or with the lecture, or whatever it is. And I think those two things that you mentioned and you addressed during your IATEFL plenary that I've been using quite a lot are the spacing effect, spaced repetition or practice, and retrieval practice. Those are very important. So can you please tell us what are those, and how, and then of course you can, I know you've mentioned a lot of great studies during the plenary, and then I can link the plenary here so people can watch.
Yes.
But if you can tell us, how do we know those things work? Where does the research come from, spacing and retrieving?
Yeah. So those are probably the two strategies that have the most backup from research. And when I say this, I don't only mean research that is conducted in the lab under very controlled conditions, right?
Yeah.
So because this is where you start off in cognitive science, this is where you go. You go very much controlled materials, conditions, so randomization of participants to different conditions. So to really make sure, are we just really testing that the difference that we see on a performance later on a memory performance test later on, that the difference is really just due to a difference in those two conditions, right? Let's say you have one condition that used massed practice, so just cramming, and one condition that took the same time, but instead had, let's say, a week in between studying for the first time and restudying the material. So what we want in a first step, have a very much controlled experiment where we find out if the only difference between those two group of students or participants is really the spacing in between one study episode and the next, do we find a difference on the memory test, right?
Yeah.
So, and there are plenty of those lab experiments that show the effectiveness for, in this case, spaced practice, right?
Yeah.
And then the next stage is to look at the same effect, again, spaced practice, and to use material that is more authentic, right?
Okay.
So instead of very controlled material, we just open it, like we let in a bit more uncertainty, right? So we open it up a little bit, we make it a bit more complex, we use material that teachers would use in their in the classroom. And we rerun that experiment and see, okay, is there still this effect? Do we find that? We would assume yes, but let's test that. So that's probably the second stage. And the third stage is, let's take it really to the field. Let's have, either we have a group of researchers conduct the experiment in the classroom, or one step higher in the applied research category, we just tell teachers what should happen and have them implement it, and then see if there is, again, still a difference between the groups who have engaged in spaced practice compared to the ones who have stuck with a mass practice schedule. And
in other words, just to clarify, so cramming mass practice is, I study, let's say, 1 hour of this material today. I studied like 60 minutes of whatever that I have to learn today. But spaced would be, I will study 60 minutes, but not everything, not all of it today. I will split that into different sessions, right? And I will add
30-minute sessions.
Exactly.
So you
add space between.
Exactly. So the time is exactly the same. So you still stick with an hour in total. But the thing that you do, you study 30 minutes today and 30 minutes, let's say tomorrow or a week later, right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Exactly. And when we make recommendations for practice, we make it based on those fundamental research, lab studies, those more applied ones, and the fully applied ones. Yeah. And we have seen evidence for better performance for space practice compared to math practice in all of those different research scenarios.
Wow. That's how robust it is. Yeah.
So exactly. Yeah. So we're making recommendations on the robustness of finding it with, you know, with those different research methods that I just explained, with different materials, with different age groups, and so on. So that's where space practice comes in as one of the bigger pillars in the science of learning, to be a strategy that we have seen evidence that it works in different ways, in different scenarios, disciplines, and so on. And the same is true for retrieval practice, which again is the idea that if you are revising something or restudying a material, you can either go ahead and reread it. So look at your slides again, reread the textbook chapter, and so on. So that would be just rereading or restudying. Let's label it this way.
Yeah.
Or instead of doing that, you close all your materials, everything, and then you try to retrieve information and that knowledge from memory first before looking at your material. So you engage actively in that retrieval process. And the retrieval practice effect is the fact that in the long term, students tend to perform better if they have engaged in retrieval before, compared to just restudying, highlighting, or looking over the material over and over.
And I remember reading when I was at the University of Bristol, I read some papers. I think Rodiger, Karpicki, Dunlusky, they talked about this effect of, so if you restudy the material and then you take a test immediately after, you might actually perform better. But then when you come back for a retest, like a week after, the ones who restudied the material, they perform, much worse than those who actually retrieved. So they actively try to recover that, like from memory. And then in terms of, learning, long-term learning, that's better. Because, maybe you get fooled. Well, I studied again, I reread the material, and I got a good grade because I did the test immediately after. But what happens 1 week later? Do you still remember, the material, right?
Exactly.
And that's what it shows, right? Yeah.
Exactly. That's what's so interesting about those, and I call them effective learning strategies, is that the immediate feeling you have while you're applying and doing the strategy does not necessarily translate into performance later on if you take a test later on, right? So there is like this judgment of learning, and your judgment of learning is fooled by your feeling of fluency, your feeling of easiness, right? And all those strategies, they add, and you talked about this, they add some difficulty, they add some effort. So it feels that you're struggling a bit more, it feels like you have to put a bit more effort into the process. And if you ask students immediately after, that engaged effort, that is usually then attributed to, I may not have really understood it really well, so I may not really perform really well in the future. So I will predict that in the future on the test, I won't really perform really well, when in fact that struggle and that specific effort is what makes information stick better in memory. So it's kind of I do this with my students, where I actively teach study skills to them, and then tell them, your initial feeling when you're going through the process of retrieving information, or if you implement space practice, that always will introduce some kind of forgetting, right, is a bit more effortful. So it will introduce that effortful processing.
It's counterintuitive.
Makes it
right?
exactly.
They
That
feel
makes
it doesn't work. Well,
I know.
because I have to
Yeah,
make more effort,
exactly.
right? Yeah. So
Exactly,
you're
exactly.
saying, in other words, Carolina, that the way we think we learn is not really how we actually learn, you know? And I think that
Our
we're all biased.
intuition,
Yeah.
exactly. Our intuition
Yeah.
can be wrong. Our intuition can be wrong, and I think
Yeah.
that as, that sometimes goes for me as a teacher as well, right? I might
Yeah.
have the intuition to do a specific thing because I think that will help. And then I look at the research, like, oh, maybe, the research actually tells me to do something a bit different. And then I use that as a way to inform my practice and to make the change. I will say so that I have, sometimes maybe implemented something because from a research perspective, it is something that has been shown to be very effective for
Yeah.
learning or for students. But then students hate it and they don't use it, right? And don't engage it with it. And that's
Yeah.
another thing. So
That's
if
another
that's the
variable,
case,
right?
that's
Motivation and
another variable.
interest.
So,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, all the science of learning I put in, if no one uses it,
Right. Yes.
it's not going to be used. So I might then have to
Exactly.
find a way to make it work again in the classroom. So there are so
Yeah.
many factors that play a role. Yeah.
But I think that hence the need for science, really, because science is, well, at least it tries to be unbiased, you know, because of how it works, the scientific method and, peer review and
Yeah.
replication of studies and all of that. Because, if we just teach based on our intuition, and if we just teach according to what students think work best because, it feels good, it might be wrong. It might not work as effectively as we thought, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so important. But okay, so you were talking about spacing and retrieving. Can you give us some concrete examples of how you actually use them in class? I mean,
Yeah.
during your plenary, you mentioned even, studies conducted with language learners, which is quite interesting also, because I think a lot of people, some people at least, they find that, well, the science of learning is not applicable when we're talking about English language teaching. But, some of the same principles are at play. So why wouldn't it be applicable, right? So can you give us
Yeah.
any example of, okay, so how do I implement retrieving? How do I use retrieving to teach this or that? How do I use spacing to teach this or that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's no problem. I teach large lectures. When I
Yeah.
talk about large lectures, it's between, I don't know, 200 to 300 students, right? And one thing about retrieval practice specifically is that I need to find a way for as many students in the classroom, I mean, ideally everyone, but
Yeah.
let's say as many students in the classroom to engage with the process of retrieving information from memory and retrieving previously learned material, right? Now, I also know if I have a classroom of 300 students that there will be differences how fast they are in retrieving.
Yeah.
There will be differences in how prepared they were in advance that will affect how easy it is for them to access that information from memory. There is a fluctuation in the classroom if people are paying attention and so on. So all these kind of things. And I think for me, the most important implementation that I'm using is I will never just ask in the class to retrieve information and volunteer people
Oh, yeah.
um,
I don't want to
to
expose
say
them
to
and say,
say the
hey,
answer. No, yeah,
yeah,
not really
yeah,
exposing, but the thing is when you
yeah,
ask something out loud and have people
yeah,
retrieve right then, I will always have probably the same people raising their hand, right?
yeah,
Those who maybe just are paying attention, those who have engaged quicker in the process of retrieving.
yeah,
And the moment someone says the answer, no one else is engaging with that process anymore, right? It's that chance is over. That's
yeah.
done.
And those who
And so
were
what
not paying attention, they will not volunteer to anser the question,
they will
right?
not volunteer
Yeah.
exactly.
So, yeah,
Yeah, and my classroom is too big as well to be
yeah,
fair to do these kind of things.
yeah,
So what I do a lot of class polls where I give people some time to think and then contribute their answers in that way, completely anonymous. And I get much more engagement from the classroom. So everyone, contributes a little bit, retrieves a little bit. I can also see all the responses. So if I do open text and I have them kind of to recall something from a previous lecture, I can see where are they in their knowledge, where are some misunderstandings, and I can use that information that I quickly skim to correct some misconceptions, for example.
Excellent.
And to give feedback right away. So that's one thing I do. Another thing I do is I use take-home questions instead of take-home messages, because messages are just statements at the end of a lecture, right? You read over them. That's it.
Yeah.
But if you can formulate every take-home message as a question instead. And the moment you do that, students will more likely to think about, what is the answer to this, right? Do I know the answer to this? What do I need to do to find the answer to this? And I instruct them on how to use those take-home questions. So I say, at the end of each lecture, you will have 3 to 4 take-home questions. And what I would like you to do is to start your revision, take a question and try to answer it from memory first. Because A, they are using retrieval practice then, and B, it gives them a concrete step to start revision, which is the most effective way to, combat procrastination, right? Because if you have too many movements, like if your range of movement is too big, then it's really difficult to kind of push the task that you don't want to do forward. I know even where to start and so on. But if I tell you, these are 3 questions, start with the first one, answer that one from memory, then they can do that.
Good.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's another way, a very low key how I implement this. And in all those kind of things, what I do, I instruct them to what I think would work best for them to use, like how to use that resource that I do. I can give another example if you like.
Yeah, I'd love. Well, let me give you one example, and you tell me if I'm doing right or not. So when I'm teaching my students, and we've gone over new content, input, right? I usually take a quick break and I go like, okay, so I'll give you 1 minute just to think about something that you got from this explanation or from this material, but don't share yet, because usually. What I see, especially when I'm teaching online, and I teach large groups as well, is that somebody would just jump and into the chat and just write the answer. Then those who were not, they were almost retrieving, they see that and then interrupts it. It derails the whole process. So I say, okay, I'll give you guys 1 minute to try to just think about something you grasped or something you got from this, and then we can start sharing. Does that make sense? Am I doing retrieval practice?
Exactly.
Good.
That's exactly it. Like you give some space for different students to engage in the process first.
Yes.
Before before people post any answers and so on. So that's an excellent way to do that. So think first, right? Think first about it, have your own idea about it, and then you open the floor so that people can share and so on.
So I'm proud to say I'm doing it right. and maybe we can tell the listeners or people who are watching this. So why don't you pause the video or this podcast right now, and you try to remember some of the things that we were discussing. That's retrieving, right?
Exactly.
This will help you learn better. Yeah, good. Yeah. But you said you had another example.
Okay, I'm going to give you I will give you a final example because I'm really proud of this one. So the final one is as part of my my year 2 psychology students. They each semester they take 3 multiple choice quizzes, and those quizzes are open book. So so they take them online. They can use their resources. And they're really low stake. I mean, each of those quizzes is worth just 2%. It's mainly for me. Yeah, it's really, really low stake.
Yeah.
For me, it's a way for them to engage with the material. And for me, what I really want them to do is I want them to engage with spaced retrieval, right? Because on each of
Right.
those quizzes, materials from the entire semester that so far has been covered is going to be on the quiz. So they have to look back at material that was, covered 5 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago and so on. And what I do, I give them 2 attempts at the quiz, right?
Okay.
And I instruct them how to use them. I said, you can use them the way you like, but if you want to gain the most from those quizzes, do the following. For the first attempt, just use your memory. Don't look anything up, right? Just use your memory. What do you think is the correct answer is, and go through a full attempt of the quiz without looking at your notes, without looking up anything.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to give you a second attempt, the same quiz, same questions, different order of questions, but same quiz. And for this one, you can look up stuff. You can answer the questions that you were maybe more confident on. For the ones that you had flagged that you weren't really confident, look it up. What's the right answer there, right? And I'm going to give you the highest grade because I actually expect you to do well on this one, right?
Yeah.
And for me, what I really want you is in being brave to engage in that process of retrieval practice, which means that you will make errors, which means that you will not know all the answers, right? But to be comfortable because you have the safety net. I'm giving you the second attempt, right? And students love it. They absolutely love it. They actually want more quizzes. I'm like, I can't give you more. That's it. Like 3 years. It's plenty. It's plenty of quizzes. But it really kind of, I get this in all my student evaluations since I have introduced it, as I think we really love those quizzes. They're really quizzes where you are encouraged to use your memory first without having the fear that it will affect your grade massively.
That's so good. I think that's a really good way to teach them how to use retrieving, because I think most students, at least here in Brazil, I think everywhere in the world, errors and mistakes are stigmatized. You want to get the right answer like the first time you try. And that's, I wanted to comment on something that has to do with fluency and this perception that, it's easy, then I should be learning. But I think a lot of people don't realize that we have different memory systems, And when you reread something, for example, it's not really your semantic memory, like I really know this word, this concept. It's just your sense of familiarity that I've already used this material, and that doesn't really translate to actually knowing what is written there. And I think most people get that confused, right? If you pick up a book that you used to study, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, your brain goes like, yeah, I know this. It's more like I've used this. It doesn't mean that I know what's written there, right? Because that's semantic memory. That it's kind of different, right? Yeah.
So it's recognition, right? So the process is like you can recognize it, but you may not be able to really reproduce it or to say it in your own words, right? And that would be the recall process that we want to have, right?
Exactly.
And I think, that sometimes it can fool you. You have seen it before, and you're like, I know this, but do you? But
okay, so show it to me, prove it.
Exactly.
Close your material.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Close your material, close your eyes, try to recall it, put it in your own words, right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden you can see, that takes a bit more effort. That's a bit more, I can see now the bits that I have actually understood. And that's now I know the bits that I have not yet understood. So it helps in some ways, right? It helps with your metacognition, with your understanding of your own understanding, much more than just seeing the information right away.
Okay, well, now we're moving towards the end of this episode, and I could probably spend the whole day talking to Carolina, especially because this is such a fascinating topic. But before we start geeking out a little bit, I just have one final question about spacing. And I think spacing is such an effective way to get your students to learn more. But I think teachers struggle with implementation. Like, how do I implement spacing into my teaching? Some books they try that. Some materials they have some kind of can do or like box or what can you do after you've done this lesson, so you can always go back to it and it's kind of embedded, let's say, into the material. But is there something you can tell us, Carolina? How can we implement spacing more effectively? Do you have a specific moment of the lesson that you go, okay, let's try to remember something we did 2 weeks ago, and how far do you go? Can you give us a tip about that?
Yeah, I think with spacing, there are so many different ways on how you can actually implement it. And I do truly believe, because when I talk to teachers, they are already implementing it, right?
Yeah.
So whenever you ask a question about a topic that you have taught last week, the week before, and so on,
Yeah.
they are retrieving information. You're using spacing there, right? Because you are reintroducing a topic or reactivating a topic at this point in time that you have taught before. That's a very much low-key, informal way to do this, as a question. You can do it through homework assignments. So assign homework on something that was not immediately taught, but maybe taught 2 days ago or a week before, so that if you have a worksheet, we have some aspects on there or some content on there that has been covered more immediately or more recently. But then maybe you have a bonus section there. This is like old material. This is maybe from last semester. Let's make it wild, and see, is the knowledge still there? What is the struggle exactly? And help them a little bit to engage in the process. And it can be done, for example, through homework. Right, as long as you are open in your communication and are clear, this is the aspect more recently. These are a bit more older. Give it a go. How does it feel, right? Can you retrieve it? What's still there? So that's another way to do that. So there are different, and as well, it doesn't have to take much time as well, because if you do it from time to time, you go back to older material. If you do it more continuously with shorter activities here and there, then you're building that knowledge in students as well, right? And they get used to this kind of instruction, to say so. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, now it's time for us to geek out a little bit, if that's okay, because I don't know. Are you a geek? Do you consider yourself a geek? Do you watch geeky movies and really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I have the impression, and maybe I'm biased here, that most scientists, they have some geekiness in them. That's why they wanted to pursue the career in science, I think. But I one of the things that I've been watching recently, and I want to know what you watch, what you read, is Black Mirror, because of the there are some very interesting devices in some of the episodes that you just put on, like your temporal lobe or something like that, the side of your head, and then you can record everything and never forget. Do you have any interest in that at all? Like, what do you watch stuff like that? You feel like, wow, this is, because as a scientist, that we're very far away. We will probably never reach that. It doesn't make any sense. But do you still watch that?
So I wouldn't really. I don't watch much sci-fi per se. I was serious.
Yeah.
But obviously, I do watch. I watch series. That show me a bit more, or kind of where I see a bit more human behavior as well.
Like dystopian futures and things like that?
No,
fantasy?
No.
Okay.
So very much kind of like, I love Friends as a series, and I love the Gilmore Girls as a series.
Oh, okay. And, me too, yeah.
So there is, and in those series, I mean, Friends is the one that I recently rewatched for I don't know how many times I already rewatched that one. But there are a couple of episodes that tap onto specific aspects that that comes from psychology. There's one where Phoebe tries to teach Joey French.
Which is hilarious. Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, so where
Je m'appelle.
And it's kind of, the idea of, imitation and how you send in information, how it perceived by another one. That's all in the psychology, right? So only because you send the information in a certain way does not mean that it is received by the person in the same way, that they can actually reproduce that information. So that's quite interesting there. There is another one where it's about altruism, and whether altruism actually exists as a whole, whether
again Phoebe and Joey, right? I think the Telethon thing, right? That we're calling, I'm a big fan too. I've watched the whole series like 7 times probably. So
I think there are those kind of different smaller things here and there sometimes where it shows the psychology. There's another one there's another one about memories and how our memory works in a way that you think you're recalling something that happened, but it actually never happened, right?
True.
And so it's all those kind of serious have these kind of little perks. And when I see it, I'm kind of, I love this. I can't explain this to you. I know exactly why this happened. It's like exciting. So that's one of the series where I think you have quite a lot of psychology in there, and they used a bit of those.
Am I right to assume that you also like the Beatles, because I can see a poster?
I love the Beatles.
Right? Yeah, that's good. I'm a huge Beatle fan. Like a Beatle maniac. Actually, I have a songbook because I play the guitar. Right, so when I was, I don't know, I must have been 19, 20 or something, and then I started listening to the Beatles. And then a couple of years after, I learned how to play the guitar. Actually, I learned before. And then one of my greatest friends gave me a songbook that is really old. It looks dirty and really used up and everything. But it has all the Beatles songs, all the chords.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite gifts because I really use it. I play a lot of songs, So
it's amazing.
And have you seen the movie Yesterday?
You should have brought your guitar.
Yeah, I should have, right? Yeah, I should have. Yeah, next time I'll do that. But there's a movie, Yesterday. Did you watch this one? That what would happen to the world if everybody forgot about the Beatles except this one guy who tries to remember? So he's retrieving the songs, right? And the fun part about that movie is that he gets some of the lyrics wrong because he can't remember possibly everything, right? But
exactly.
But it's a fun movie. I love that movie. Yeah.
But that's actually quite good. That's such a good example of it, right? So you listen to songs, you listen it over and over again, but you never reproduce it and recall it yourself, maybe in that way. And so you have kind of a memory of it, and you can recognize the song, and you can maybe sing along when you hear it. You can, like, if the song is not on, like, write down the lyrics. You're like, okay, that's not difficult. I've never engaged in that retrieval practice, right? So that's a good example of it, actually.
So true. Well, I think this is the end of the episode. Carolina, thank you so much. I had a lovely time chatting with you. I have to ask you, do you have any final message to teachers and students listening to us right now about the science of learning, about the Beatles, whatever you want, okay? The floor is yours. Yeah.
I think what I would say to students and to teachers is that to keep an open mind, to see, when you see something new that is suggested, find out more, maybe try to find out more about it, what it actually is about. There are many free resources out there that can be used to get a better idea of, a specific strategy. And so I would just, keep an open mind and see. But also with that, you are an expert, like for teachers, you're an expert in your field, in your discipline. And if you have tried something and it didn't really work out, maybe talk to other teachers why this could be, how it can be improved, how it can be tweaked, and to kind of engage in that activity of finding out, because I do this as a teacher as well. I try to find out when something didn't work out. I'm trying to find out, okay, what went wrong there, what could be improved in what way. And my big I'm a big fan. I'm a very big fan to actually involve students as well to find out what they think would maybe help for their peers to engage, let's say with a strategy, with something you have implemented, because we know, that's a good thing, but now we want them to engage. So what needs to happen for them to engage with us? So to have kind of a dialogue, that would be my suggestion. I guess.
That's perfect. And before you go, I know you're engaged with a lot of different projects. So how can people find you online? I know you are one of the learning scientists, that
Yes.
I think I want to get Dr. Cindy Niebel next, so let's see if she will accept my invitation. She has done a talk for us before. But can you tell us about this project, where people can find more about it, and anything else where people can find about your work?
Yeah, it's at learningscientist.org, so you can just check out our website. We have free resources on there, posters. We have many blog posts. We publish something every week. We have a podcast as well, to listen to it and to engage in the science of learning. So we try to always, summarize new findings, to find a way how it could be implemented, what it means and what it doesn't mean. So that's one resource. I'm also the founder of the TILE Network, which is the Teaching, Innovation and Learning Enhancement Network. And that's an external speaker series. So it's on a monthly basis. It has paused right now. It will be resuming in September, where every month we have a speaker. It's online, so everyone can join, and we talk about different aspects of education, of applying some research into education, best practice examples, and so on. But yeah, it's all open and for free for people to use.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carolina Kuepper-Tetzel, everyone. And stay tuned for the next episodes of the Learning Cosmos podcast. So, Carolina, it was a pleasure. I hope we can talk more, sometime soon. All right? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.